really feasible that the vast amount of speciation could have taken place, in 4,000 years or whatever the time frame is? If we're assuming that it really was a worldwide flood and all the land animals were killed except for taken into the Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
I mean,
how do we account for so many different species? I get it. Well, there's a couple of things that can be said about it. First off, organisms are capable of producing tremendous variety by the process of recombination, genetic recombination, and phenotypic plasticity. So they can really they can adapt in some remarkable ways relatively quickly to their environments. But life can be divided into kinds, though, and the kinds produce varieties of themselves, and so we have an explanation for it. And here comes Standing for Truth. I want him to chime in on this too. It comes down to heterozygosity. The information that God put into the genomes of these creatures give them the ability to produce tremendous variety of themselves without changing anatomy. So varieties are morphological, they're not anatomical. And so that accounts for a tremendous amount of variety. But if you, and it's also, I personally believe that God, oh, my cat's going crazy. All right. So it's also possible that God created more than one kind of cat, for example. God may have created small cats. He may have created large cats in all the organisms. For example, bobcats, lynx, African wildcats, and several other species may all be one kind. And yet tigers, lions, saber-toothed cats may have also been one kind. So it's possible that God created more than one kind of cat, more than one kind of ape. It's not necessary that all apes are derived from a common ape. Like, God didn't have to create just one kind of ape and then all apes be varieties of that ape. It may be that God created 5 different kinds, original created kinds of ape, and all the ape varieties we have are adaptations of those 5. So that's a possibility as well. In fact, I believe that's true. There are hundreds of different, 10,000 species of birds. Standing for Truth is fixing to talk about this, but I'm going to touch on what he's about to say real quick before he begins. He's going to provide some great information. I think it's possible that God created many more than one kind of bird. God may have created 20 or 100 different kinds of bird.
That's right.
Maybe 1,000 different kinds of bird, and they're able to produce 10,000 different species. Go ahead and tell us more about it, Standing for Truth.
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything Brother Neff was saying with the built-in genetic diversity that he was calling heterozygosity, with front-loaded heterozygosity in, say, the original animal kinds that God would have created, speciation events, adaptive episodes, they can happen quickly. And we're actually seeing that today with like epigenetics, for example. But when it comes to the species, that's a really good question. And what Brother Neff was talking about is the perfect explanation. And what you can do actually is look up the exact numbers of species today and just calculate backwards to 4,500 years since the Ark, for example. And you can see, I'm sharing screen here, you can see the numbers are actually perfectly in line with young Earth creation expectations. But here's what's funny. If you look here, there's about 10,000 bird species today, okay? Therefore, we as young Earth creationists, we would predict, and the thing is, bird species, that's one of the more difficult ones to account for. So I like to go for the most difficult. For example, if you go lizards, you've only got 4,600 lizard species, 3,600 species of snakes. I mean, that's one species per year in 4,500 years. That's easy. Bats, you've only got about 1,240. So birds. So here's the thing. We would just need to account for about 2 to 3 per year in 4,500 years. Just last year, 2017, you can see here, a new bird species has evolved on the Galapagos Island. And what's funny is, as Neff was explaining how these original kinds would have been front-loaded with created heterozygosity, the exact same mechanism that creationists would say would need to take place to derive new species is exactly what was observed on the Galapagos Island with this new bird species. What was seen was shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. So it's like more, let's say, genetic variability towards less genetic variability. That's what we would say as creationists. Now, here's the thing. That makes sense. So we're seeing new bird species today. So 2 to 3 is very easy to account for in 4,500 years. We only got 10,000 bird species. Look at the evolutionist side. Look at the deep time evolution model. So they say birds today, modern birds, evolved from theropod-like dinosaurs roughly 65, maybe 100 million years ago, okay? So if we see new bird species today before our very own eyes, why aren't there like 500,000 bird species? If deep time evolution is true, 65 million years, for example, why are there only 10,000 species? Why are there only 4,600 lizard species, 3,600 species of snake, bats, cats, dogs? You know, the numbers of species are perfectly in line with young Earth creation expectations. So, yeah, how would you answer that question? You know, why so few species if evolution is true?
Let me interject something. Recently, the theropod dinosaur to bird evolution story has come under fire from secular scientists themselves. They're starting to think it could, some have even written it could be the other way around, because birds are now known to have coexisted with dinosaurs early in the age of dinosaurs. Cretaceous period, they found completely avian footprints in Cretaceous rock. I mean, that's long before the dinosaurs went extinct, right?
Yeah, so that's like, so you're looking at maybe 120 million years, and yet only 10,000 bird species today. So like, to spaghetti alien, it looks like you're skeptical, which is good. You know, how would you, if you do hold to deep time evolution, why are there not 500,000 bird species? If, as Neff is pointing out, it would go back even further than 65 million years, 100 million years. You know, how would you account for that?
Well, I mean, wouldn't extinction explain some of that?
Well, even if you account for extinction events, let's say that if you accounted for extinction events, then the 10,000 is still far too few, because in 100 million years, you're going to need like extinction event after extinction event after extinction event. So it's just not feasible. And what's funny is because you were saying that special creation doesn't have any explanatory power, but I've got in front of me several technical papers by creation scientists, PhDs in genetics, biology, for example, and they've made testable predictions. They said, okay, if there's this many bird species today, if there's this many cat species today, then we should expect this many per year in 4,500 years. And this is exactly what we're seeing. But evolutionists, like you said, they have to account for extinction event after extinction event. I debated a zoologist who would probably be the best to ask this question to, and he admitted he couldn't make predictions because they would have to invoke unrealistic numbers of extinction events, you know. But for us, it just is perfectly in line, the number of species.
Okay, another couple quick questions that kind of bother me. Archaeopteryx, how do we explain that fossil?
I guess that would be up to Brother Neff if he wants to answer it, if I want to answer it. Oh, I think Brother Neff might have left. So when you're looking to transitional fossils, what you see when it comes to Archaeopteryx, what you see when it comes to Tiktaalik, what you see when it comes to, say, the mammal-like reptiles, these are the exceptions to the rules. So when we see interesting mosaics, maybe like the platypus, you know, the living platypus today, this is exactly what we would expect based on the design hypothesis. I mean, we see interesting mosaics in the design world, like the military engineers and develops vehicles called amphibious assault vehicles, which blends the features of land vehicle and vehicles built for the ocean. So this is just expected from an engineering perspective. But when you actually get down to the nitty gritty of each transitional form, like Archaeopteryx, you can see even experts in in evolution would say that Archaeopteryx, for example, was nothing but a perching bird, or Tiktaalik was nothing but a bottom-dwelling lobe-finned fish. But even if there are some interesting mosaics, it's perfectly expected from the biblical design model. If evolution was true, you'd see the rule being the mosaics, being the transitionals. But we only see a few that we could sit here and argue with, and Archaeopteryx is one of them. So,
yeah, if you go to your Museum of Natural History and look in the fish tank, you'll see a creature that looks virtually identical to Tiktaalik rosea, but the biggest difference between them is the distance between the eyes. No kidding. Looks just like Tiktaalik. So, I mean, how transitional is that creature anyway? It's just not. It's rare in the fossils. That's what made Jennifer Clack and Per Alberg and Henning and all the others who found this creature jump for joy, was because they couldn't find such creatures in the fossil record. Then they find one. But gosh, they're living today. So, big evolution there, huh?
Yeah, it's the same thing with the I forget the name of it, that fossil fish that's however many millions of years old, supposedly. But what was had a question regarding? Oh yeah, what about wouldn't the rarity of fossilization itself explain the lack of transitional forms to some extent?
Well, the only mechanism that can explain the fossil record is fossils require a creature not only to be buried rapidly, but they require highly mineralized water to seep into the ground where that animal is, to replace its bone with calcium carbonate. And so the waters of the ocean today don't possess the materials necessary to create fossils. So if uniformitarianism is true, and the oceans have always been like they have today, relatively clean, then there could never have been fossils, you see. There certainly couldn't have had a fossil record so abundant, so many fossils. It's just not possible. So only the flood explains why the waters of the earth could have had such mineral content in them so as to create a fossil record to begin with. Uniformitarianism can't explain the fossil record. It's a no-go. So when evolutionists say, oh, the fossils show evolution, say, what? You can't have a fossil record by uniformitarianism processes. It's not even possible. The waters of the earth have never been dirty enough with calcium in order to make a fossil. The flood of Noah is the only mechanism that can explain that.
Well, Brother Neff hit the nail on the head there, but if I could screen share real quick, I'm curious if Alien is familiar with this latest study, especially because you're talking about the species and then, some of the so-called mosaics. Well, first off, if you want to use Archaeopteryx, you'd have to address or the evolution, because it sounds like you're skeptical, which is good. You're open-minded. But like Brother Neff was saying, they found bird footprints earlier than birds were supposed to have evolved, with the theropod dinosaurs, for example. Also, the fact that I'm not sure if you're familiar with this new study, but they analyzed barcodes across 100,000 species, and what they discovered was genetic boundaries, very clear genetic boundaries, and that over 90% of species today originated at exactly the same time, which, as Brother Neff was talking about, the Noah's flood explaining the fossils. Well, we know of a bottleneck that could explain such low genetic diversity. In the study, what they were looking at was a very specific, highly conserved mitochondrial DNA gene. It's called the CO1 gene. And across all these different species, they had extremely low genetic diversity. And the evolutionist, in one of the authors, he said, this conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. But, people like, Neff and I or Otangelo, we don't need to fight against it, because it's exactly what we would expect, is that all today's species originated at the same time, just 4,500 years ago at the flood, during the flood bottleneck. Are you familiar with that specific study? It's pretty fascinating, Alien.
Yeah, well, let me throw this out, because I've listened to Josh Swamidass, some of his his views on the evolutionary time frame and everything. Do you think that he's just in error, or don't you think that his knowledge of genetics is pointing him in the right direction?
Actually, that's a very good question. So Joshua Swamidass, I'm very familiar with him, as well as the arguments from Biologos, and their biggest argument is, how can we explain the levels of genetic diversity in humans today if we truly descended from, say, Adam and Eve just 6,000 years ago, or our last Y chromosomal ancestor, which would be 4,500 years ago at the time of Noah. But for one, as you can see in the slide here, that assumes that mutations are the ultimate source of all variety. But someone like Swamidass, it's a silly argument because theologically speaking, would God have created Adam and Eve in the biblical kind with no genetic diversity built in, with no DNA differences? Of course, God didn't mean to be fruitful and multiply and do this through cloning themselves. So it makes sense that Adam and Eve would have been front-loaded with pre-existing functional DNA differences. And as you can see here in the slide, time is not required for the diversity today because diversity can be designed and built into Adam and Eve. What's funny is if we truly did descend from just two people that were front-loaded with genetic diversity just 6,000 years ago, we should expect low genetic diversity in humans today. And that's actually what the evolutionary community discovered, and they were shocked that they ended up inventing you're probably familiar with the hypothetical out of Africa population bottleneck in order to explain the low genetic diversity. So yeah, Swamidass, that's his main argument, and it fails. It fails scientifically and theologically. We have no reason to believe that God would not have created Adam and Eve with, as Neff was saying earlier, with front-loaded genetic diversity. It only makes sense.
Yeah. On top of that, the fact that it's been discovered that Africans, the various tribes, there are numerous tribes of people in Africa, numerous. And these various African peoples have greater genetic variety between themselves than Europeans do or Asians and Mid-Easterners. So this contradicts the evolution theory. Man's diversity, genetic diversity, should have increased after he came out of Africa. And so the African people who remained in Africa should show lower genetic diversity than the Europeans and the Asians and everything. But when we compare the genetic diversity of those peoples to Africans, we find the opposite of what evolution expects. There's greater genetic diversity amongst African people than there is against the peoples that live outside of Africa. That contradicts the evolution theory. The evolution theory would have us believe that after man came out of Africa, his genetic diversity would continuously increase because of single nucleotide polymorphs, if nothing else. But so what we find contradicts the theory.
That's a really good point, Neff. That's a fact. Everything about the out of Africa scenario with human origins from the evolutionary perspective that Neff and I are talking about is actually contrary to the empirical data. Even the 1Y chromosomal line, for example, here's a paper recently by Dr. Jensen, Harvard graduate. Evidence for a human Y chromosome molecular clock. Pedigree-based mutation rates suggest a 4,500-year history for the human paternal inheritance, exactly what we would expect with the flood bottleneck. Obviously, that 4,500-year ancestor would be Noah. And also, when it comes to mitochondrial DNA, if you see this chart here, this is same Harvard graduate, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. He derived this. This is a mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree. And when you map it out, you can see right in the middle. And Joshua Swamidass knows all about this. And his rebuttals, I find, are very weak to it. But you can see three major haplogroups, okay? L, M, and N. Now, who were we repopulated by after the flood? Well, Noah's three daughters-in-law, Noah's three sons and their daughters-in-law. Women, we inherit mitochondrial DNA exclusively from our mothers. And lo and behold, we've got three main mitochondrial DNA haplogroups signifying Noah's three daughters-in-law. Plus so the thing is, a starting point from Genesis has very, very serious genetic implications, genetic expectations. We can make predictions, retrodictions. There's a lot of explanatory power there. And we just see it more and more every day. Genetics is confirming the Genesis account of human origins. It's fascinating. So are you familiar with Dr. Jensen's work there, Alien?
I haven't read any of his papers, but I've heard you guys talk about him a lot. Another question that I won't say it plagues me, but I think is an interesting one is the whole, chromosome 2 debate.
We love that one.
How do you explain that?
Well, right here you can see a paper. This is from a secular journal, The Evolution of African Great Ape Subtelomeric Heterochromatin and the Fusion of the Human Chromosome 2. And they conclude chimpanzee and gorilla chromosomes differ from human chromosomes by the presence of large blocks of subterminal heterochromatin thought to be composed primarily of arrays of tandem satellite sequence. So in other words, for the layman, if there really was an ape-specific chromosome 2 fusion, because if humans and chimpanzees truly are related, we split, say, 6 million years ago from a common ancestor, and at some point in the human line, there was a chromosome 2 fusion, we should find traces of this ape-specific satellite DNA in the human chromosomes, around the reputed fusion site, and yet it's not found. We differ from chimpanzees there. Not to mention, here's a paper by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. A problem with the alleged cryptic centromere is that its human alphoid repeat DNA sequence does not closely match chimpanzee centromeres and chromosomes. And not only that, the area where the telomeres are supposed to be found, if there was a fusion, highly, highly degenerate. So everything that we actually see around that area, and Brother Neff can go into the functional nature of the so-called reputed fusion site that's overturned it as well. But all the evidence, once again, is opposite of what you'd expect if there really was a fusion event. So good question.
Right. The alleged fusion site is now known to be spanned by a set of genes that produces helicase, the machinery that duplicates, not helicase, but polymerase 2, which is a machine that translates information in the DNA. The problem with that is this, think about it. So if for this to be true, the only way that could be, if it was a fusion site, is for the information that codes for this machinery in the cell to have been written over information that was written over the two ends of the chromosomes after they fused. It would have to have been coded over, like on a hard drive in a computer. You have a piece of information, you have two files, you deleted them, but they're still technically on the hard disk, and then the hard disk comes along and rewrites new information over the top of them. That's the only way that it could be there. So the evolutionists are stuck with believing that for some reason, somehow, after these two chromosomes fused, genetic information got written over the top of these by replacing the base pairs to turn this into a set of genes that spans across the fusion site that codes for the polymerase machinery. Now, what process is going to do that? There is no genetic. DNA doesn't operate like a hard disk drive. It doesn't just rewrite over. Well, I don't need those bits of information. We just write over that with some new. That destroys information. DNA doesn't work like that. It cuts, inserts, and binds information. It doesn't write over the top of existing information. That would be completely destructive to the genome of the organism and introduce the horrific diseases, deformities, or death. It can't do that. So this kills the idea that it's a fusion, because there's no mechanism in genetics whereby a string of information just gets written over the top. A string of information gets completely recoded as information that produces a cellular machine. That doesn't happen in genetics. So this by itself kills the fusion site idea.
Well, if you think of it this way, Alien, you don't gain highly important genes, as Neff is talking about, by just slamming together two chromosomes. And that's exactly what we see that this fusion site actually is. It's the reputed fusion site that they say where the fusion took place is overlapped by a functional gene. So the evidence actually seems to suggest that that so-called fusion site, not to mention the satellite DNA problem, the degeneracy problem, the lack of a cryptic centromere like we were talking about, but that fusion site really doesn't look like it's a fusion site at all. As Neff is saying, it's just a functional component of the DDX11L2 gene.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, the genes that code for these molecular machines that is allegedly written over the top of the fusion site is not just something that evolutionists complain, oh, that's Jeffrey Tompkins garbage. They point to the creationist scientist and say, oh, you're stupid hothead creationist scientist. That's his information. That's not true. It's in 3 major genetics databases in the world, the three major genetic databases, one of them in Japan, two of them in the United States, that where even the secular camp acknowledges that this information spans across the fusion site and it codes for polymerase. So this isn't just some idea that some creationist is inventing or come up with. This is recorded as a science fact by this mainstream science. It's in their databases that this genetic information spans across the fusion site. So it's not just something invented by creationists to give an account. It's their camp that says so too. So that kills the idea. It can't be a fusion site. There's no mechanism to rewrite a series of genes across the top of other string of information to code for, DNA doesn't just say, well, we need a place to store some information for polymerase. Why? We already got it over here. I don't know. It'd be fun. Hey, let's write it down over there. It doesn't work that way. The gene,
Well, it's funny because you'll get it, and I've had full debates on the chromosome 2 fusion, so has Neph, and they'll try and downplay the actual expression of the area, the expression levels. They'll try and downplay the function of the area itself. And this directly from Dr. John Sanford in Contested Bones, he goes over some of the components of that area, and he says the reputed fusion site sequence reveals that it's an active promoter for the transcription of an alternative transcript. It binds at least 12 transcription factors. It initiates RNA transcription, which begins with its own sequence, and it has a chromatin profile that further supports its active promoter status. So
yes,
there's no denying it.
And it's involved in 250 different cell type developments.
Right. So there's no way you're going to gain that kind of function by slamming together two chromosomes.
No.
And what's funny is even if there was a chromosome 2 fusion, because of the fact that, as I was saying earlier with the Ventura paper, that's actually a secular paper, that chimps have very distinctive and very large satellite sequences at the ends of their chromosomes, and it's absent in man when those large ape-specific satellite sequences should be seen flanking the reputed fusion site. Therefore, even if there really was a fusion, it would have occurred in the human line. And based on that lack of ape-specific satellite DNA, it would have just occurred probably at the time of the flood, where there was a bottleneck, and obviously would have given humanity the opportunity to pass the fusion on to everybody. So it's funny, it's 0 for 2 for the evolutionists. The evidence suggests there was no fusion, but even if there was, it's better explained under a biblical creation model.
Yes.
That's fascinating. You guys are speaking pretty much over my head on a lot of the scientific terminology, but isn't there something like with the telomeres that leads them to believe that it actually is a fusion site?
It just has the visual appearance of two telomeres. That's all. That's all it is. It just looks like the arrangement of the base pairs looks like two telomeres. Just so happens to look like two telomeres. That's the only evidence they really have.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, they were actually shocked in the original chromosome 2 fusion paper. They thought there would be more telomeric sequences if there really was a fusion event. And what's funny is it turns out that what we do see there is highly degenerate. Now, the evolutionists had said, well, we expect it to be degenerate because they got to force fit all the data into the story. So they said, well, it's degenerate because it's been millions and millions of years, and therefore degeneracy has occurred, or the telomeres themselves were degenerate when the fusion happened. But here's the funny thing. Here's what destroys that rescue device. It turns out that those internal telomeric-like sequences that are found in that area are actually found all over the genome. And there are many papers, I've got a couple here with me, published that give us functions in expression of those sites. So now what they're finding there is not just special to that area. They're found all throughout the genome. They're functional DNA elements, nothing to do with the chromosome 2 fusion. So that was a good question, Alien. Yeah, that's been dealt with too.
I need to correct myself. The site does code for helicase, a complex group of helicase genes are there. So. And I was right when I said it first, and then I tried to correct myself. I had forgotten. It does code for helicase. The machinery that duplicates the DNA molecule just expands across that fusion site. And that just can't, happen naturally. And on top of that, it was reported by one secular scientist named Costa in 2009 that at least 18 different genes, human genes, span that site, and these are not found in close proximity in any chimpanzee or ape. In other words, the locations, there are only 2 locations for DDX11L found in chimpanzees and 4 in a gorilla, and their locations don't correspond to those of the human, so they're not found in the same spot. So if we were to have inherited our DNA from them, then these genes should be in nearly, if not exactly, the same locus in the DNA, but they're not. So this information that codes for helicase and polymerase in the human genome that spans across this alleged fusion site isn't found in the same location in apes and chimpanzees. It's found in different places, way over there or way over here. Not in the same location. It should be in relatively the same spot, if not exactly the same spot, if we inherited those genes from apes.
Well, one of the other things that I find kind of points towards evolution from what the little studying that I've done into it is the whole retrovirus theory. Doesn't that point towards some type of common ancestry?
Well, with me and Neff, that's actually probably one of our favorite topics. So are you ready for an hour lecture on Well, I mean, for me, I could sum it up in probably 20 seconds. These endogenous retroviruses, and there's actually other classes of retrotransposons. There's a lot of what evolutionists claim are the ancient remnants of viral infections, through millions of years of evolutionary history. But what's funny is they're finding, and I've got paper after paper, I might as well just screen share, but it's showing that these retrotransposons are highly, highly functional. And functional in a crucial fashion. They're regulating gene expression. They're involved in self-stress responses. And what's funny, when you ask an evolutionist, I've debated biologists, so has Neff, I'll ask for empirical evidence for a non-functional retrovirus going from non-functional to something extremely functional in development or cell differentiation. So all we say regarding these retrotransposons is that they are functionally functional DNA elements that were front-loaded by God in the original created kinds. And that's why we see that they're incredibly functional, like critically functional. In the mouse embryo, they've discovered that if you knock out one of these certain classes of retrotransposons, as the mouse is developing, boom, you snip it out, suddenly the mouse stops developing and it dies. So according to the evolutionary theory, I guess mice were never having children for millions of years until they managed to get infected by a virus. And, so go ahead, Neff. What do you think, brother?
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. That's true. They keep discovering extremely important, if not critical, functions for these allegedly viral DNAs that were inserted into man's genome. There is a mechanism where viral DNA gets inserted into your genome. That's a known process. But to believe that the information in the genome of a virus, which is typically 3,000 base pairs long, could have the information to regulate vastly larger amounts of human genetic information so as to produce the critical features of organisms like a human being is nonsense. That's like believing that the owner's manual for a photographic light manual, which is maybe 10 pages printed both back and front, has got the information necessary to regulate a team of 1,000 workers to produce an automobile in a BMW plant. It's nonsense. So here are some of the discoveries that have been made about alleged ERVs. When random and uncontrolled integration of ERVs has been observed, the outcome is cancerous tumors. ERVs function as promoters, initiating transcript of RNAs. They're the workhorses of the cell, which have many important functions. The ERVs in gene regulation, they regulate genes for fetal development of the human placenta, liver, colon, and salivary glands. So, boy, the genetic information in a virus has the instructions to instruct, okay, you cells over there, you be specialized to become this kind. And you genes, you express yourself for the next 30 minutes while these guys are going to shut off. And I mean, are you kidding me? No way. So, and then these ERV roles play roles in human immune system also to prevent the body from attacking itself. They function in cell tissue and tissue organization during fetal development. They have there's evidence that most of them don't become integrated into host genomes very well, so they're involved in creating specific organs. So here's the thing: if these genes that are allegedly ERVs, once viral, play a critical role in the development of the human placenta, liver, colon, and salivary glands, and I think other organs, then let's imagine that it would have had to have been integrated in a creature that exists long before humans, because if humans diverged from a common ancestor with chimpanzees, both humans and chimps would have had the ERV before we diverged, because we both have salivary glands, colons, livers, and placentas, right? So if this is an ERV is necessary to create these organs, we have to keep going back down the evolutionary tree to find what organism didn't have the virus and because it didn't have a placenta, liver, colon, or salivary glands. We're going to be going way, way down the evolutionary tree to find that organism. We're going to have to go before rats to find it. Okay, so the evolutionists countered this by saying that the information was usurped. Well, so if the organism already has that became infected with these ERVs already had a liver, placenta, colon, and salivary glands, then it has to have, the genetic processes had to have said, you know what, I'm tired of using these genes to make our liver, colon, and salivary glands. This guy just came into the neighborhood. Let's just use him instead. Huh? How does that work? You know, you're already got genetic information that's regulating genes to produce these organs. Why would you, this idea that the evolutionists have that these genetic information from a virus became adopted to be used for those purposes after, just several million years ago, before chimpanzees evolved, a couple of million years before that, it's nonsense, because you've already got perfectly functional genes that are regulating the genes that produce the liver, colon, salivary glands, and placenta. So it makes no sense to believe that the genome, the genetic functions of the organism would dismiss the existing genetic information that's performing that regulation, and then just adopt the information in the virus, and it happens to have the information that all things just keep going as though nothing ever happened. Or mutations would have to modify the genetic information in the virus DNA to make it do what the here's another potential scenario. It has the genetic information that regulates the other genes that develop these critical organs, right? And while life is going on, somehow mutations are transforming the ERV's information into that, so that it performs the same function as the existing information that regulates the genes. And then somehow the genome just says, I don't know, let me pick one of the two. We'll go with this guy instead. And how does that happen? How does random mutations transform the genome of a virus into the information that's capable of regulating the development of these organs? And if that happened, why would it resemble a virus anymore? So it doesn't actually resemble a virus. The thing is, they can't reverse engineer this. They can't take this information and decode it and say, look, this matches the genome of this virus. It doesn't match the genome of any virus. The only reason they claim that it's viral DNA is because it's a little snippet of unique genetic information that's found in the genome of a human and also of a chimpanzee. And a creator might be responsible for that kind of thing, where I'm going to use the same computer programmer. If you click File, Open, and Browse, you get a little dialog box in Windows for that, right? That's good code. The guys that use this might use that same series of code in a browser. They might use it in in a video making software. They might use it in a different one because it's good code. It has certain functions that are good, and it's common. It's functional and useful in those different software applications. Well,
Common design.
Common design. It's also useful in the chimpanzee to regulate the genes. It's also useful in the human. But there's just no evidence that it actually was ever the genome of a virus.
Well, and I'll say one last thing, Alien, and then let you go. But I've shared screen here just to show you some visuals on what Neff and I are saying. Because a lot of the times the skeptics or the critics will say, you know, all you have is creationist sources or creationist citations and papers. Like what we're saying all comes from the secular literature. This is a fascinating one published 2019 August, just a year ago. Far from being junk DNA, the pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to influence genes and chromatin. So this whole idea of co-option or adoption, like Neff was saying, it's nothing but rescue devices, fancy storytelling. So like Neff said, when it comes to the common design, I typically ask, are these retroviruses really the ancient remnants of viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? Now, the fact that we see they are highly functional and important in our genome, for example, the ALU, they influence alternative splicing, regulatory activities of transposable elements. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses and immune response, like Neff was talking about. You know, these are all from secular journals. So therefore now it makes sense that we share these DNA elements with the chimpanzee. And they'll often say, like I've debated these biologists, Dr. Dan Stern, Cardinal, Dr. Stefan Fellow, they'll say, okay, well, what about the patterns? What about the nested hierarchical patterns? Okay, if these are created units of DNA function, which the evidence suggests they are, it makes logical sense that we would share more of them with the chimpanzee than we would with like an old world monkey or a fish or something like that. So those patterns are expected. We share more with a chimpanzee than we would share with a bacteria. You know, this is just expected from the common design hypothesis. So are you familiar with all of these functional roles and these this new research on the retrotransposons there, Alien?
Only at a very cursory level. I've listened to a lot of LPP's debates and yours, so just on a very cursory level. But yeah, to me, mutations never were really a viable mechanism, just from a layman's perspective. To like the evolution of a bird's wing, why would however many millions of mutations that would need to occur that would cause an organism to become less adapted to survive, as it lost its claws and teeth and started to form, the beginnings of wings or feathers, how would that actually help it survive? And why would it continue in a process where it actually would use Bernoulli's principle of flight? To me, that never really made sense, and I've tried to look up the evolutionary explanations for it, and running, gliding reptiles, I don't think really gets it. But so you guys definitely make some valid points. And as I said, you're I think it's great that you're standing up for the scriptures and for Christ. And you've definitely given me a lot of food for thought. So I think I need to maybe look into it, in a little more detail with scientific papers and see if I come to the same conclusions that you guys have.
No, do that. Yes, investigation is important. I would strongly encourage you to study this stuff myself. It's good that you're willing to do so.
Amen. Amen, Alien. Great questions. I know I can speak for Otangelo and Neff. We love answering these questions. We love answering the tough questions. We're just here to, help brothers in Christ and sisters in Christ, and also help people that are on the fence or skeptical like yourself. So, unfortunately, my kids are getting kind of fussy. This has been fun. I got to get into bed, but Neff, or say if you guys are doing streams later on, I can probably join. But Otangelo, thanks so much for bringing me on your channel. You're doing some phenomenal work for the Lord, and yeah, great job to thanks for having me on.
Yes, I appreciate you coming here. It's actually the first time that you guys are here at my channel, and I'm seeing that number of visitors that are assisting are 23 people constantly now. That's fantastic. It was starting with 10, we are at 23, and I hope that doing this kind of work here on Sundays, it will help to grow our channel and answer questions to people that are on the fence and are in doubt in regards of these issues.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, guys. Thanks for spending the time and sharing with me. God bless you guys.
God bless. Anytime. Anytime. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome.
Yeah, I think I will finish my live stream, already 3 hours here.
Okay.
And,
Well, thanks for letting me come in, Coach Angelo, and I'll drop in again sometime.
Okay, fantastic. So to everyone that is assisting, good night. Thank you for being here, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Okay, God bless.